welcome. It's great to have you all here. The pretext is More's birthday. We were wondering whether we should wait till next year, till it's 21, but no, we can always have another birthday party then. So, okay, over to you, Bruce, the first few years of More.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be in this position. And I think I'm in that position because I'm probably the oldest one around who was actually involved in the first Hague conference in The Hague, which I really only learnt today. I realized, I should have known before, that it took place 100 years after the Tsar's peace conference in 1899, I think it was. And that's why they picked on that particular date because of the anniversary. And it was an absolutely epic affair. I really enjoyed the whole thing. And we took quite a large group over there, stayed in a kind of caravan or something, and took part in everything that went on. We were so involved with the local governments that I remember the Dutch government actually had sent a minister along to be a co-speaker with me. Anyway, it was a very good event, and thousands, about 10,000 people came to it from all over the world, and that was impressive. Just as impressive for me as the thing that took place quite quickly afterwards was when we filled the Westminster Central Hall. About a month or two later on, we had a UK equivalent of what went on in The Hague, and absolutely filled the place. In fact, I may be wrong, but I think that Paul Rogers, who's here this evening, that Paul Rogers was part of it in those days and actually had to take his speech outside on the grass because there were so many people there. Paul, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Anyway, the More movement took off very well. I was very sympathetic because I never felt myself to be a very good pacifist. I was too many conditions about it, but the More was opposed to weapons and war generally, and thought there were better ways of solving disputes amongst human beings than killing each other. And I think that's a very important thing for More to have done. And we did so many things. We went all over the country, especially on Remembrance Day, and we got very friendly with the British Legion and other groups, the Imperial War Museum. So we weren't kind of isolated as a funny lot of peaceniks. We were quite involved in peace movement generally around the place, and remembrance therefore became more than just remembering some people who died who haven't died. And we did a lot in going around schools, picking up on them. I remember so often going to schools and finding that the Ministry of Defence had discovered that I was coming to this particular school and would send down some general or admiral or somebody or other to put me right and to correct me. I don't like being corrected, as you probably know. Anyway, this went on, and we had mystery walks, the peace history conferences, so much about peace history people don't know anything about. And so we had lots of episodes about exploring how things had developed in the past. So I think that actually we gave More quite a good kickoff, and has remained that way ever since. It's quite a prominent peace group, and I'm delighted to be still connected with it, even though it began with walking up and down a beach somewhere on the Hague, somewhere near the Netherlands, where I started. I've developed since then into all kinds of peace activities, and I'm very proud to have been connected with so many nice, helpful, visionary, non-egotistical people as I have in More. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm just going to share my screen when I've, okay. What else has MAW been doing? Well, you can see the MAW banner gets about. This was Aldermaston in 2013. Done some DVDs. War No More outlined many of the strategies for abolishing war. Conflict and Change shows these two major world problems can't be separated, and that's something that is really, right up with the agenda now. Now, we've done a lot of booklets. I'll just mention two. We Will Remember Them, which was an anthology of alternative readings and reflections for the remembrance events, and that was popular, as was its predecessor. And the little booklet From War to Peace. Heather worked really hard on that, and I helped out a bit. We've done songs, we've done music, and as well as a couple of CDs, there was a song cycle to mark the centenary of the First World War. Moving to more recently, more submitted evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee and to the Defence and Security Review. We're trying to get a sensible ideas about security in. Now, I'd love you to visit the shop. It's not all serious pamphlets. There's some fun things there if you have any children or grandchildren who need their dolls to have jumpers. Finally, I'd point you towards the website, which had a big revamp over the last year. And I don't know, can you see that little button there? The search button is really fantastic. You think, oh, has this site got anything about climate, disarmament, whatever? And yes, that'll take you to it. So I do urge you to look at the website. Right. Thank you for that. And it's time for us to have our two main participants, Paul Ingram and Mererid Hopwood. Now, let me, hi Mererid.
Hello, Shomai.
Mererid is currently in Aberystwyth, and with any luck, Paul will be spotlighted. Here he is. And then I'll be disappearing but reappearing at the bottom. Here we are. It's all going according to plan, this bit. Okay, can I ask Mererid first, what's your relationship to the peace movement?
The peace movement, well, that's a good question. Paul and I were discussing before this evening, getting to know each other over the Zoom, I suppose, in preparation. And I had to confess that I can't really remember a time when I didn't sort of know that war was wrong and that avoiding it was something we should all do. And so that inherent assurance, knowledge that an anti-violent and anti-war stance was the one to take. I can't remember not having that. I haven't been through a road to Damascus kind of experience on that. But then in Wales, you can probably tell that my name is Mererid, and therefore that I am Welsh. We like to think that we like to feel proud about quite a long tradition of peacemaking and peace campaigning. And I remember being taken as a child to Tregaron, which is a small place, mid-West Wales, that is in fact a square with a pub, and around that square and the pub everything happens, but on that square is an enormous statue of the Apostle of Peace, yr Apostol Heddych, and we stopped the car and looked at this in awe. And I know that Henry Richard is a big hero of Bruce. He looks up to Henry Richard. But then, and he of course is the man who took the complex word arbitration, cyflafareddu in Welsh. It's quite a difficult word in Welsh too. Arbitration, all the way from Tregaron even to the Tsar in Russia. That sense of, come on, we have to sit around a table and talk our way out of this problem. We have to meet in the middle, compromise, reconciliation, arbitration. All these unpopular, uncool, unheadline grabbing words have been in the background. And then I was very fortunate to be asked to become chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in Wales, which is Cymdeithas y Cymod. And again, there we're very pleased to think that Richard Roberts of Blaenau Ffestiniog was its first secretary. And now, of course, it's a global thing, International Fellowship of Reconciliation. But I stood down from that role last year because finally we have a Peace Academy in Wales, a Peace Institute, Academi Heddych Cymru, and I'm its secretary. And perhaps I can talk more about that a little later. I wasn't really expecting that question, Tim, you threw me. But there we are. I hope I answered it. I took a long time, so Paul will have less time. Sorry, Paul.
Oh, don't worry, lovely. Same question to you, Paul. What's your relationship to the peace movement?
Well, I've got quite a varied set of relationships. I'm a Quaker, have been since I was 16. My first CND march in 1983 was very, very big impression on me. Sense of togetherness. The peace movement for me is one of fellowship, and I think it's really important for us to see that sense of fellowship between us, particularly when we disagree, and we often do, and that's good. That's a strong part of what it means to be part of this movement. I was on the Stop the War Coalition steering group during the Iraq War and a few years after, representing the Green Party on that. I also ran the British American Security Information Council, what some people have described as one of the intellectual arms of the peace movement, and took it into a direction of collaboration, cooperation with governments, and now I'm cooperating with the Swedish Foreign Ministry on an initiative to draw non-nuclear weapon states together to more effectively act in the interests of nuclear disarmament.
Thank you. Next question, Mererid. What was it that persuaded you that war is a scourge and that we need to develop other means to resolve conflicts?
Well, yes, as I explained, I'm afraid, and I wish in a way I could share some great flashing kind of moment where it all came very clear to me, but that hasn't happened in my case, it's just a sure knowledge, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because if you've got half a brain, you can almost always see the other side. You can always sit down and think, yes, well, maybe they've got a point, and find yourself thinking and imagining. But on this matter, I absolutely cannot see the point of war, and I cannot understand how people can justify it. And the interesting thing for me is when I've had an occasion to speak to high-ranking soldiers, leaders of the army, they share the same view. The actual war is the last thing they want. Nobody wants to go to war, it seems, but then every now and then we have a politician or two that can whip up some support to this idea. And somewhere there is always a sense of power and wanting to hang on to that power, and that sense of knowing more than others and being more right. And I know Paul wants to talk about that. But then we did, didn't we? Before the others joined us this evening, we had a little sense of what power can do to you when Sally got hold of the spotlight button and felt this kind of force. But yes, it's that. And then suddenly there's a great storm of enthusiasm being whipped up, and very ordinary people who are not at all belligerent find themselves thinking the only way out of this is to kill somebody else. But of course, they don't use those words, and perhaps we can move on to talk to language later on. We never say that. We say that we go to war, and we don't actually spell it out. And then, of course, the anesthetic of the numbers soon kicks in, and once one becomes lots, then the casualties don't seem to hurt us quite as much. So there are many ways that we can, I think, address this issue yet again, although I know that at times we think it's an impossible task. It's not. And one of those ways, I think, is to rethink language. But we can come on to that.
Thank you. Paul, same question.
Yeah, so I think as Mererid suggested, I feel that the seeds of war are within each and every one of us. The sense that we have of our defensiveness and our righteousness, of the way in which others that we may not understand or disagree with are wrong, and that we need to take a stand. And this is very laudable in all sorts of situations. It's important that we do take stands. It is true that that others are often greedy, and they are caught up in their own power and their own sense of righteousness. But you know, my reading, having spent now 20 years, almost 20 years. Looking at the Iraq War and the origins and thinking about that, is that it was righteousness more than greed that drove Tony Blair and his coterie to invade Iraq, and I think all of us can drop into that place quite easily. So I came to this in the first place from a sense of anger and righteousness that a small number of almost elderly, middle-aged men could hold the world to ransom with their nuclear weapons. And it was the anger rather than the fear that drove me. And increasingly, I'm thinking that we need to see those seeds of war within ourselves and build a way of interacting in a very highly political and social way, but in a way that builds bridges rather than sees the world in terms of black and white, right and wrong.
Thank you. Okay, Mererid, what's your sense of the problems in beginning with security as a point of departure?
Well, this brings us straight to that question of language and words. Defense and security. Defense against what? And what does security mean? What makes the ordinary person, people like you and me, feel safe? What makes us actually safe? What gives us security? And surely that is things like a home that's dry, food enough so that we're not hungry, work, meaningful employment, something that we can go to in the day or in the evening, whenever the shift is, and feel that we're doing a good turn, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. And what else makes us feel secure? Health and a good health service. Is it really an army? I don't think so. Seeing a soldier does not of itself make us feel safe. And the defense, as we've just seen now over the last year, what we needed defending against, of course, wasn't somebody else, a person that wasn't quite like us, somebody that we can label an enemy, but a disease. And yet we were caught short. We were caught out because all our monies have been going in millions of pounds towards strengthening an army, not strengthening the health service. And it can be done because it has been done. Think of Costa Rica. 5 million people, what, Wales is 3 million people. I don't know how many people there are in the UK, more than 3 million. But that model, that Costa Rica model, does still give me hope. They have given up on an army, and the money that they used to use to equip one, they have diverted into education and health service. It can be done. And I don't know if you take much store in these polls, but by the way, the Costa Ricans always come up towards the top on feeling bodlon. Now, what's that in English? On feeling satisfied, shall we say, perhaps more than happy. So examples like those give me real hope. And perhaps I can just throw that word hope in there, Tim, moving from security and defence, but because we're talking about how we can make this thing happen, I think we should again look at hope. And I think, I'm afraid that we've slipped a bit into perceiving hope as a sitting back and a crossing of fingers, a passive kind of place to be. But real hope is an action. And when you hope, it gives you two forces. First of all, it enables you to see the better place. And secondly, it gives you that drive to get there. And I think if we can hang on to that and rethink that word too, that may be a good idea.
Thank you. Can I follow up with that? You mentioned Costa Rica, a small state. How can smaller states face up to those big ones that seek dominance on the world stage, Mererid?
My turn again. Oh, yeah. Dear. Well, I suppose
it gets fairer later.
I suppose I should be in quite a good position to answer that question, because, as you know, we've been now, what, 500, perhaps 600 years. We're back in 1536 when Henry VIII had, yes, you can understand it from his point of view, but from our point of view, it wasn't such a good idea. The Act of Union was put into force, and Wales became part of England. And it's amazing how quickly a whole people can disappear. When you think about 40 years later, less than that, 1574, Raphael Holinshed wrote his Chronicles, and it's an important book, a history book, important because this is the book that Shakespeare used, no Google and Wikipedia in Shakespeare's time. And he turned to this book for his history plays. And what was the title of the book? The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. We disappeared in 40 years, but we're still here. So, you know, small nations can hang on to things like identity, like language, even though there is a force against it. And again, that's another reason for hope.
Thank you. Yeah. Paul, how would you answer the question of how you deal with dominance and aggression?
Well, picking up from where Mererid just finished, I think we can see many of the smaller states practicing some really effective strategies in dealing with dominance. You look at Ireland, you look at countries in Scandinavia, the Swedes that I'm working with now are attempting to build bridges and to approach those countries that engage in a dominant strategy with open questions rather than positions, looking at ways in which the conversation can build understanding of the joint interest. But you know, facing dominance, it's really challenging. It's really difficult. And the first thing that I think we have to do is recognize that it's difficult, that sometimes we're not going to have easy answers. But I wouldn't just start from the idea that there can be a silver bullet. We need to see the way in which we can build heaven on earth here now. And that is about living a lifestyle that is true to our essence, true to who we are, and that's challenging. That's difficult. I give talks to primary school children quite frequently because they're interested and they've got their challenges. And the question I often ask them is, how do they deal with the bully in the playground? And I get some fascinating answers. It's often not the case that they will go to the teacher or whatever because they get accused of being a snitch or whatever. But they realize that the way in which you deal with a bully is you actually have to live with them. You have to understand them, and you actually, the most effective way of dealing with a bully is making friends with them and speaking their language. And then but not the language of violence, but the language of humility and coming together with others who are also suffering from the actions of the bully. So it's about building compassion. And I think
that's, if I can, sorry Paul, if I can come in there, that is fascinating, and taking us to the school is a really important thing to do, because education is where it's, well, you know, it starts, doesn't it, long before we become adults, and teaching and learning ways of dealing with people around us is important. But the whole system needs to change, because at the moment it is driven by a force that makes people think about an outcome that is a gain that you can measure. And we're not sending children to school in order to see them develop into people who can deal with that kind of situation. But again, I'm just sitting here now, and I was almost going to cross my fingers there, but I want to share with you the fact that in Wales we've got a new curriculum coming up, Curriculum I Gymru, and if it happens, the change is going to be radical, because it has 4 purposes, the new curriculum, and none of those purposes states that it's about having a list of qualifications at the end, so many A stars, so many Bs, so many Cs, and so on. The 4 purposes are, and I have them here, to make so that all the children and young people in Wales would be ambitious, capable learners who are ready to learn throughout their lives. Secondly, healthy, confident individuals who are ready to lead fulfilling lives as valued members of society. Thirdly, enterprising, creative contributors who are ready to play a full part in life and work. And fourthly, ethical, informed citizens who are ready to be citizens of Wales and the world. So when the inspector comes in now to school to look at the teacher teach and the children learning, it won't be about, so where did I see this child progressing here on that learning, but where did I see those purposes being reached? Well, that's how I like to think about it. And that's enormous. Peace education is another thing. And last night I was in a meeting on the Peace Manifesto that the Quakers, Cymdeithas y Cymod and others had put together before the elections we've just had. And we were discussing education, militarism in our school. This is quite a problem in Wales, as I'm sure it is in England. Recruitment. It is such an embarrassment, such a disgrace that we're still recruiting such young people, the only country. And when I say country there, I have to include, of course, England. As a UK, none of the other countries in Europe are allowing this to happen, and yet we are. And statistically, the percentage of visits to Wales Ireland and Northern Ireland and Scotland is higher than to England, and the percentage of visits that go to the comprehensive schools, the state schools, is significantly higher than those that go to the private schools. And so there's that, but then of course the curriculum. Those two things are things that the schools need to look at, I think.
We may well touch on education a bit later on, but I want to sort of do a clunky change of direction and ask Paul, I understand you've been advising non-nuclear weapon states on how they can encourage nuclear disarmament even when they themselves don't have nuclear weapons. How does that work?
Yes, it's an incredibly frustrating position for most states in the world. We all have experience within the peace movement here, within a nuclear weapon state, of banging our heads against the brick wall. But other states have even less influence than we do. At least we can try and appeal to our fellow citizens. They have no power in this situation in the conventional sense. But actually, power is a little more complex than the power people think. So it's about trying to change the equation. So I created this idea called the stepping stones approach with the Swedish government, and this involves three separate features. The first is, by its very nature, incremental. Now, that's very unsatisfactory to many people, but inside the incrementalism there is radical vision. So let me take you through this process. The first step is accepting the situation as it is. It's not agreeing with it. It's not saying it should stay as it is. It's saying the world is as it is, and from where it is we now need to move. So it's about analyzing and accepting. Then there's a process of visioning. So movement for the abolition of war has a vision of a world without weapons. The stepping stones approach has a vision of a world without nuclear weapons. And that vision then drives the action. But in visioning, the non-nuclear weapon states are drawing the nuclear weapon states into a process of vision as well. And then there are proposals for action. Now those proposals are going to be quite modest in the first instance, because this is a process about building relationship and building trust. And in that action, there is a certain degree of expectation that the world will change, will shift a bit with that shift, with that change. And then we come to a point where we evaluate and then adapt the strategy. So there's no rocket science here, but it is about implementing the existing agreements that the international community have already agreed to. The second feature is that it's systemic. So it's looking at this from a holistic perspective. And the third, most important, is that this is pluralist. It is accepting that everybody in this system, all the states, have a valid perspective, and that if those perspectives are involved in the process, then trust is built over time. So this is a peace process. It's not a process where we, whoever we are, the non-nuclear weapon states, the peace movement or whatever, have all the answers. It's a process where we build answers together with people, with states that profoundly disagree with us, but in which we can actually move. And I'll just finish by explaining how I persuaded the Swedish foreign minister that she should adopt this approach. I met with her in New York in the United Nations, and I brought along my friend John. And I said to her, I said, look, I'm Paul. I've been involved in the British peace movement, Stop the War Coalition. I've broken into Air Force bases. I've planted bulbs beside the runway. My views about nuclear weapons have not changed for 30 years, but my methods have. And here's my friend John. And John said, I'm Rear Admiral John Gower. I used to be in charge of nuclear weapons decisions in the British Ministry of Defence. I was commander of nuclear weapon submarines. I believe in nuclear deterrence. My views have not changed, but my methods have, and I'm working with Paul on this project because this project is about building bridges, and it's about opening understanding and building a process where we can disagree, but we can move forward.
Very good. Fascinating.
And then we're back with Henry Richard and the arbitration and reconciliation, and I think, Paul, that is a absolutely fantastic way. It's not exciting. It reminds me, I printed that out before this thing. I hope I can find it now, but Llangollen, I don't know if you know about Llangollen. It's a town in North Wales, and since just after the Second World War, the people of Llangollen did something very bold. We have a cultural gathering called an Eisteddfod in Wales, where we bring people together to compete, sing and dance and compete. And the people of Llangollen said, right, we're going to create an international Eisteddfod, and we're going to invite those people whom just last year we were calling the enemy, we were killing. And they recognized, just as Paul has, that it's not really bold. That approach isn't really bold, but it's an approach that makes a difference, and it takes so long. And this is what they had to say, and it is so inspiring still, 70 odd years later. Llangollen believes that in the age of atom and rocket bombs, which ignore national boundaries in their capacity for destruction and death, peace demands a boldness equal to that shown in war. Though this expression of a small mountain town's boldness for peace may be far less spectacular than a deed of war, it is at least constructive, opening a door, maybe a narrow one, through which men and women of many lands may meet freely in friendship, stimulated by the mutual love of music making. And it goes on to talk about the art of peacemaking. And I think what you've outlined there, Paul, about the stepping stones and the meeting and the recognizing from the beginning that we probably won't agree, but just avoiding that violent turn is very special. And I feel very humbled to be on the same call as you, being able to take that to such a level, and having influence on people around you, but also on other states.
Thank you, Mererid. I have another one for you. We're celebrating MAW's 20th anniversary, and we have no doubt that in 20 years' time we'll be marking our 40th. So this is a long-term project. It's a long road. It must involve education. How can we approach education in a way that encourages peace?
I think I may have touched on that already, Tim, in my description of the new curriculum in Wales. And there are other initiatives out there that deal with, the restorative practice, that we bring children together with the teacher, with a leader, to sort out arguments on whatever level and disagreements. But the classroom is an interesting place to look at in terms of our ambition to abolish war, because of course it's been many years now since violence has been abolished in the classroom. In my day, as I imagine, Tim, in yours,
oh, yes, definitely.
It was the unless ... and the finger pointing to the cane on top of the cupboard. And that was the threat. Unless we behaved, that's what would happen. And we kept the peace with that threat, and we've banned it. Any teacher who would even think about doing that is an unfit teacher and would be struck off the list. And yet, the state who employs those teachers does that, exactly that, to its own citizens, unless ... and there's the policeman with the truncheon or the gun or the gas, and then to the citizens of other states, unless ... and there's the nuclear submarine or the drone or the missile or the bomb. And when will we get to that? I'm not sure. But if we make enough of the peace thing in schools, then we've got a better chance. You see, if you Google peace studies and in UCAS and Wales at the moment, nothing comes up. Thank goodness for Bradford in England. But it's gone out of fashion, this word. It's now about conflict resolution or war studies. I think we need to bring the word peace back on the street and make it just not the realm for the ideals and realms of dreams. Bring it out, dust it down, use it, talk about it, so that the ideal becomes more within our reach, more likely somehow. Something that we don't think, oh, it'll never be the case. We will never have a world without war. Talk about it. Use the word peace. We've got 2 words for peace in Welsh, heddwch and tangnewydd. Use both of them and make them everyday words. And that, I think, would start, a great place to sow those seeds are in primary schools, secondary schools, and then universities. And that's one of the aims of the new Academi Heddych in Wales, because it is a partnership of universities. All the universities of Wales have signed up to it. And so we're hoping, as well as being commissioning research that is a robust, high standard, impartial research that can give advice to government. We also hope that we can make the idea, the concept of peacemaking more of an everyday thing, alive in the minds of the people of Wales. And by the way, these peace institutes are common things. It's just that Wales is the first of the 4 nations of Britain, and wouldn't it be lovely if all the others just had one?
Yeah.
Or maybe Bradford can do for you, because that's quite.
Bradford is nice and close to me here in Leeds, anyway.
And it is quite something special. But yeah, you were talking there about examples. The Ireland example, they have a peace institute that came about. That came from that thing that they managed to deal with their conflict peacefully, and they don't have I think it's 150 years now since they've demilitarized. And they talk about the Ireland example, the Peace Institute in Flanders, Belgium. Again, that came about because of an embarrassment, a scandal that was to do with the arms trade. And they have now an arm's length body. It took many years to establish, just like the Academi Heddych in Wales did. I think they took about 15 years following this scandal, but they have it now. They have 7 full-time researchers, 1.5 million euro budget. And the deal is this: the government has to consult with them on every matter that has implications on the state of peace. They don't have to accept the advice, but if they don't accept the Peace Institute's advice, they have to put that in writing, the reasons in writing. Yeah, some ideas.
Yeah. One for you, Paul, still with education. Do you think that independent initiatives can influence the educational mainstream?
Well, I would reverse the question. Can the educational mainstream withstand efforts from independent initiatives to stay the same? I think every little bit of the education system is open to influence from independent initiatives, because each and every teacher, each and every pupil, each and every person within education can influence each other and themselves. So I think if anybody wants to influence the educational mainstream, they have every opportunity to do so. And I think it takes some degree of focus on the individual rather than great moves of history. I mean, it's very, very appropriate to ask the question, how effective has it been for people in the past to have gone to war, to have had conflict, and to have resolved their differences with conflict? What have the impacts been on people, on cultures, on society over years? How have these conflicts just raged and raged over many, many centuries? You know, the conflict today in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine, you know, the Palestinians, you know, it's just the latest in a series that goes back thousands of years and will continue to do so as long as people answer the question, so what do you do when somebody wrongs you? The answer is, well, I go to war. There needs to be, all of us need to be asking the question, how do I deal with the seeds of righteousness and injustice within my own actions and my own attitudes? And it's really difficult for us to do that for other people, because their experiences are different from ours, and if we act in a certain righteousness and approach in lecturing others about how they should operate, then quite rightly we'll get it thrown back in our face. But for ourselves, we can ask that question, and then we can, from that place, we can then ask that question within educational establishments, and we can have people come up with the answers themselves. I've not got an answer to the question, how do you deal with the bully in the playground, that is convincing to everybody by a long way. But I've found that asking the question is probably one of the most powerful things I've done whenever I've gone into schools. And I think we can go into educational situations with much more openness rather than closed lecturing, open questions, encouraging people to think about the drama triangles that they get trapped in, the sense of victim status that they might take on, or the rescuer that they may the role that they may want to adopt, or the finger pointing of blame on others. You know, these are really challenging things that I think would fit really well within the educational curriculum. You know, how do we fall into the roles of the drama triangle, and how do we climb out of them, and how do we help other people to climb out of them as well at the same time?
Thank you.
And that brings us that sense of us encouraging the asking of the question is exactly the reverse. Although I'm sure so many teachers would want that, as long as we have these schools, the measuring system, that schools are measured against the qualifications of their pupils, then that closes that at some point, because the information has to go in. That's the danger. And educating is about drawing it out, just as you described it there. So as long as we've got that tension between wanting to educate the children and yet being measured by so many A stars, so many C's, so many B's, that's something that we're going to have to resolve.
Yeah. Mererid, you've spent much of your life uncovering elements of a culture that's been neglected under the influence of a very big neighbour. I nearly read that as a very big bad neighbour. Yet the Welsh have also played their part in the global imperialist project. How can the Welsh and the English move into a more positive future and shed the remaining vestiges of their imperialist military dreams?
Oh, hang on, I need to put that off, because when my phone goes, my screen goes. Are you still there?
I'm still here. You're still there.
We are. Oh, Diane. Oh, so you could probably hear that now. I have to leave this on because you did that WhatsApp group, Tim, but I'm going to switch it off completely now.
The WhatsApp group, by the way, everybody, is so that when Zoom fails us, Mererid, Paul, me, and a couple of others can talk to each other and say, "Oh dear, it's gone wrong." But so far, all is well. All is well,
apart from that I can't see you, but if you can see me, then
yes,
that's fine.
We can see you. You're fine.
Yes, Well, a few things there. First of all, Tim, I don't think I've spent my time uncovering. How did you phrase the question?
You spent much of your life uncovering elements of a culture that's been neglected under the influence of a very big neighbour.
Yeah, you see, again, isn't that strange that, but we are neighbours, as you said, and yet we know, or maybe, no, we know so little about each other. For me, I haven't had to uncover the Welsh culture because I lived through it. I was brought up speaking Welsh. I went to a Welsh speaking school. This is my life. I've discovered the English language, if you like, that came to me later. So that perhaps reveals something, that we're not talking even to our neighbours enough. And then in terms of Wales and imperialism, yes, you're right. There have been Welsh individuals who have taken part in all the wrong things. I'm pleased to say, of course, that because of the lack of independence, that hasn't happened, at least in the collective name of Wales. And that might be a small saving grace of the situation we're in. I don't know. But I do know that if I can perhaps uncover something for you, of course, the word Wales and Welsh comes from a very different place from the Welsh word for Wales. The etymology of Wales and Welsh is the other. So clearly it wasn't, you don't call yourself the others. It was a name given to us. While the word Welsh in Wales is Cymru and Cymro. And Cymro comes from two parts, com, together, and brogo, piece of land. And so I like to tell people that I think a better translation for Wales would be the together land. And the people in Wales, the togethers, I suppose. But what I love about that is its inclusive nature. It doesn't matter when you came here, where from you came here. If you're here and want to be part of that story, then that's what's on the tin. And maybe there's something there that we could extend, if we could just conceive ourselves as people living together on this earth, rather than as sets of others, them and us's, then wouldn't that be this is really odd. I have no idea who's out there. But I trust you are there, Tim. Are you?
Yeah, I'm.
Let's see if I can press another button. Oh, I am. Good. Don't know if that answers the question. Perhaps not.
I think it does. Okay, Paul, how do you think the UK could steer its armed forces away from war fighting and adopt a human-centered security approach?
Well, I think there are many prongs to that question. The first most obvious one is that we need to change the national security strategy, which is a political action, away from the idea that Britain somehow is a force, quotes, a force for good in the world that goes around using its military forces to impose its view of what is good in the world. This is a real challenge, and of course, current situation, it's as bad as it's ever been, really, because we have post-Brexit and a prime minister who's talking about global Britain, clearly from the perspective of Britain punching above its weight and all these kind of phrases. So there's a political struggle to be had, which I think goes to the heart of what it means, the identity, to the previous question. We need somehow, particularly the English, but I think all the nations of our United Kingdom, so-called, perhaps not united for much longer. We all need to come to terms with our past, with the way in which we built an institution, this country, on the blood of others around the world, and to have humility about that, rather than this patriotic pride that we have that somehow we invented democracy, which is a fiction, and instead we need to put the human at the center rather than the country, and ask the questions that we've been asking earlier this evening around what security really means and who it's for. But I think one of the allies that we have in this is perhaps a strange one, and that is the military themselves. A lot of these individuals have gone to conflict zones and have seen the results of what it means to send them to these places. And some of them, the most skeptical people, actively skeptical people that I know in this area of military force are the military themselves. Not all, by a long way. And some are particularly problematic, but you know, one of the most proud achievements that this friend of mine that I mentioned earlier, John Gower, one of his proudest achievements is that he cut out the military from any decision making around the release of nuclear weapons in this country. So Britain now is the only country, according to him, that doesn't have military in the firing chain of decision making. With the present Prime Minister, I've said to him, maybe that's not such a good idea, but you know, but the principle of the matter is that he, as an individual, as somebody who has trained, sees the military as men of action, and you don't need men of action with nuclear weapon buttons. That's his philosophy, but he and some of his colleagues understand the limits of the military, and their voices need to be heard in pulling the military back.
Thank you.
And Paul, you were talking there about putting the human in the middle, and I would agree. And I noticed that you didn't use the word individual, and I think that's important, because the human in the context of a society of humans, in that sisterhood and brotherhood of people around them, around us, I think that's important. And in terms of the military, and coming back to that thing about the schools, I don't know if you've read the report that's just come out about the recruitment of young people. Ed Bridges authored it, and the Peace Pledge Union and the Fellowship of Reconciliation are behind it, and they have got two main arguments there about the problem of going into schools and making the case for the military and not being completely honest about it. First of all, not talking about the health, mental and physical health problems that come with being in the army, and the second, then, the tactics that are associated with this recruiting, which portray the army as glamorous, as the seeing the world, and not being completely upright with what that career actually entails. And as we're talking about soldiers, of course, a great concern of ours, and I'm sure everybody in this call, is who looks after the soldiers when they've come back, when they've had this trauma, this experience. And it doesn't seem to be always the army.
No. Yeah. Okay. My last question to Paul, military themed again. What initiatives on military related greenhouse gas emissions should the UK government announce at COP26 in Glasgow later in the year?
Yes, that's a really, I mean, it highlights the point that the military are very wasteful when it comes to carbon emissions, and it's right at the very bottom, or has been right at the very bottom of their list of priorities, which highlights, I think, the point that the idea of security is very tightly interpreted as security of the state, and that comes at a cost, and the cost is borne. In the past, that cost has obviously been in lives and in money, blood and treasure, but it's also now clear that military activities take up a significant proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions, of our carbon footprint. And it's extraordinary just how much aviation fuel is used by a jet fighter just in a few minutes, and how inefficient the systems are. And we have been trying very hard within the civil sector to make engines more efficient. There's been very little, if anything, done at the military end. So it may seem a little bit marginal to the whole issue around war, but actually it's quite crucial that the military sees their responsibility to security in the real sense of the term, because as we've seen with the pandemic, you can spend all your money on Trident missiles and submarines, and more people die from pandemic, and climate change is already happening very much. Communities are under threat. You know, I am looking at a community right now below me that will probably be the source of Britain's first environmental refugees when the sea takes over. And the planet is changing under our very feet, and it would be the source of one of the most significant ironies in human history if the military were to ignore this. And of course, then they're not. The trouble is, though, is that the military are seeing the potential, the greater potential for conflict arising out of the fight for diminishing resources. Yeah. And that would be absolutely foolhardy for us to be spending even more on the military, because we need to fight for our slice of the diminishing cake rather than working together. Yeah. To tackle our wasteful lifestyles. Thank you very much. Well, I have to congratulate both of you, because we are 3 minutes ahead of schedule. So you kept very well to time there. I've been looking through the chat, and I picked up some of the questions, probably not all of them, because there was a lot of chat at one point. But if I could ask, Jane and Neville Grant, they asked a couple of questions. Do you want to ask your climate change? Do you want to unmute Jane and Neville and ask your climate change question, or perhaps you prefer the other one about non-state actors? Okay, I'll ask it then. So James Neville asked, Moore links peace with climate change. What happened to justice? No peace without justice. Your thoughts, please. Who wants to go first on that?
Well, I don't think we can separate these things. When think about the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them. Number 16 is peaceful communities. But you can't get number 16 without number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and you can't get 1, 2, 3, 4 without 16, 17, and so on. And they need to be represented as a circle. And so justice, fair play, for everybody, and that does mean the resources as well, and that then of course impacts on the climate. Just to pick up on something that Paul said, and I'm sure Paul will want to answer that question and will do so far better than I can, but you know, we were all struck, I'm sure, and I think it was a MAW publication that drew my attention to this first, that we don't, in the military, we don't talk about miles per gallon, but gallons per mile. And I remember thinking that that's astonishing. But let's just remember this. It may well be that the day will come that the military will be able to say that they have reduced their waste on carbon and so on. But that's just because they've got niftier weapons. And I think we have to be very aware of that at that point and not accept that then as a win, that they can spend less carbon, that they can in fact use fewer people, but get a better result. And a better result, of course, in those terms is a really awful and frightening result.
Yeah. Paul, thank you.
Injustice drives conflict. Injustice drives continuous conflict. As I was saying, one of the best examples is in the Middle East. But I think all of us, wherever we sit within our privilege or our sense of oppression, we all need to understand how we all contribute to the conflict and the injustice. This is why I think ultimately peacemaking starts with oneself, rather than looking out in the world and being angry about what the world looks like right now.
Could I ask a question here?
Go ahead.
Yes, obviously climate change is important, justice is important, and climate change does involve issues of justice, but not all issues of justice. And the difficulty that movements in the Abolition of War has is that there are certain issues around the world where injustice is so obvious that it would be difficult for more to not to ignore those and not to take a stand on them. And I mean, it's jolly difficult for you, because that would mean taking on board quite a really wide range of issues around the world. The Uyghurs in China, the indigenous population of Amazon, Palestinians. I mean, there are so many examples of this. The Kurds. I mean, it's and I can't imagine how difficult it would be for your organisation to try and deal with all those issues in order to achieve peace.
Well, thank you, and that's a really useful interjection. And I would say for each and every one of those conflicts that you mentioned, there is a common theme here, which is that there is a group of people who suffer hugely from being oppressed by another group of people who, for whatever group set of reasons, feel moved and feel an imperative to engage in the oppression. And it doesn't help for others to simply have a position in support or against without thinking about how that conflict can be, how the drivers of that conflict can be softened. And that takes a lot of empathy and compassion for everyone in the conflict. I come to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just to take one example, with a very strong opinion as to which of those two groups of people are driving the conflict in the most egregious way. But for me to take a position and say those people are wrong and those people are right simply has me contributing to the ongoing conflict. It's much more important for us to see the seeds of our own contributions to these conflicts and to act with compassion and solidarity with everybody involved in the conflict, rather than jump to judgment. Which brings me back to the point: we can see justice and injustice, but we have to move and see that justice is important, but we have to move beyond simply being judges. And we have to start thinking about how we can break the cycles of violence that drive these conflicts.
It doesn't work, you see, with the Nazis and the Jews and Hitler, you see. That's the problem. There are some evil people around, and it's time to recognize the fact that there are some evil people.
Is that Neville Grant speaking?
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, it's not that. It's
No, you're not.
If you had your video on, then we could see you.
Got the video on.
I haven't got a video, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, then I'm asking for the impossible, but that's what we try and do in the peace movement. Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks for the answers too. I've got some questions here that I'd like the questioner to ask. So Hilary Evans, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Mererid and Paul, very much for what you've said this evening. Yeah, my question is, MAW believes that alternative solutions to violent conflict already exist, and one of the most important of these is the United Nations. But there's an awful lot of ignorance amongst the general population about the United Nations, and I was just wondering what you think. How can we, in MAW or generally, raise awareness of the ideals and value of the United Nations, both within the general population and particularly amongst young people? And what should MAW be doing to strengthen the UN? Can we get anywhere as long as the veto is in existence, do you think?
Yeah, that's an enormous question, and I really don't know how MAW alone could do that, but I suppose I would take it back to the schools again. People don't talk about the United Nations often. We teach people history, we teach people all maths and all kind of things, but we don't teach them citizenship in a really serious way. It's a sort of a thing that, well, I don't know what it's like in England, but it's a thing that happens in, you know, in assembly or in that bit where you're taking the register, and talking about this as a real serious subject is, I hope, sorry, I'm coming back to this again, that fourth purpose of our new curriculum, making the pupils ethical citizens of Wales and the world. I hope that that in Wales we will highlight things like the United Nations. And there are other international networks out there as well that we really need to highlight. I'm not sure how MAW can do it. Looking to Paul, who might know.
I think the work of MAW and the United Nations Association, I know Bruce Kemp's been heavily involved in the UNA for many decades, is really crucial. And to my mind, it's a very good example of the process I was talking about earlier. The United Nations today is far from perfect. You know, people have been talking about the Security Council. It's not the only problem. There are deep challenges within the UN, but it is the best institution we have at our fingertips today, with all its imperfections, all its problems. And we have to accept that these are human beings, these are states with all the negative, difficult, messy dimensions. But without the UN, it would be so much worse. And if we can talk about the vision of the UN, if we can come back again and again to the Charter, and to have positive optimism about what the future can hold, and recognize that step by step we can gradually build support for a United Nations process that is so much better than it is today and has been in the past.
And here's an idea.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, here's an idea. And I'm beginning to worry that I'm making Wales out to be a really perfect place. It's not. It really isn't. But we do have this one good idea. We have a commissioner for the future, for the well-being of future generations. And that's taken the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and refigured them into 7 goals. But that is a good thing, a good idea. And for example, again, a bit like the Peace Institutes I've spoken about already, the government has to consult with the Commissioner's Office, the Commission of the Wellbeing of Future Generations, as I said, when they're looking at plans that could have an impact on future generations. And a recent example of that is the building of a new road in East Wales, from sort of Newport out towards Bristol. And because of the pollution that would bring with it, the Commissioner for the Future Generation, Wellbeing of Future Generations, said that it wasn't a good idea, and it's been thrown out. So it does have effect. So that's an idea.
Okay. I'm going to ask Bethan, who is one of the students who's joining us tonight. I believe she has a question. If you'd like to unmute Bethan and ask away, please. Thank you.
Oh, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi, Mererid, and thank you, Paul. That was a really inspiring talk that you've given us. My question is to do with nuclear weapons, and I'm just wondering, why isn't the connection between nuclear weapons and climate change being made, and what can we do to make that connection in people's minds and consciousness and activism? Probably for most of us here, the two things are so interwoven. You know, they both pose existential threats to life on Earth. And I've seen so many people my generation that are incredibly vocal and active about climate change, but not so much about nuclear weapons. And I'm just wondering, why has this fallen by the wayside? Maybe it's something that isn't actually happening across the UK, but it's definitely something that's happening in Wales, and it's something that I've been noticing here in Wales. Sorry, that was quite a long-winded question, but yes, diolch.
Thank you.
And Bethan, if I may say, isn't it incredibly hard to understand why the link isn't made in Wales of all countries? We know what it is to exploit the land, and I'm talking now about the nuclear waste that goes with all of this. And there was talk at one time to dump that in Cardiff Bay, and I think some of it has ended up in those parts. And you only need to say one word in Wales, and that's Aberfan. And we know full well the price you have to pay for exploiting the earth and dumping stuff, rubbish, waste. And goodness knows what the cost of dumping nuclear waste would be. And that's not even talking about the weapon itself. Do you know, Beth, and I've thought about this, and I think people are afraid, and they're afraid of climate change, so they act, but they're also afraid of an enemy. And so they still think that they need a weapon. And I think we come to that. I may be wrong. So if that's the case, it's again going back to the persuading people that fellow human beings don't need to be our enemies.
I think that's really good, Mererid, the way you put that. I think it goes to the heart of what people assume is human nature. It's deeply embedded in our culture. It is a culture. It's not a law of nature, but we seem to think it is, that people have to get security by threatening others. As you said earlier, the cane needs to be there, the threat needs to be there, in order to gain security. But you know, the inspiring thing, as has already been said, is that parenting in our culture has shifted dramatically over the last few decades, and of course it's now illegal to hit your children. and corporal punishment is now against the law in our schools, and there is hope that we can build confidence in human relationships based on the rule of law and respect for each other. And that's where the cutting edge is, I think. And I think ultimately we will get rid of nuclear weapons, and we will abolish war eventually, because we have built an optimism, a sense of possibility about human beings interacting with each other on the individual level. Much of my intergovernmental work between states is based upon my own personal experience and the learning that I've had in my relationships with conflict and with how I personally deal with stuff, and the way in which I've had to learn the hard way about my own righteousness. And I think that's the way we are going to change as cultures, is at the cutting edge. And each and every one of us, doesn't matter whether we are prime ministers or whether we clean toilets for a living, we have a great contribution to make in this cultural change.
Thank you. Can I ask John Hands to unmute and ask his question, please? Okay. Oh, good. Just unmute, John, and then we can see you, but we can't hear you yet.
Don't have a video. You can't.
I do, but it only works 50%.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Sorry. At the risk of sounding naive, why is it that people who observe that war has never proved to be a lasting solution to settling disputes, and that talk has proven to be a sensible way to do so, are regarded in this country as left-wing extremists?
That reminds me, I've been going back to look at the Lucas plan people recently, because I think, and we haven't talked about this evening, that there is room to channel energy into sorting out an arms diversification agency, whereby we would not be expecting people to lose their jobs, but just to change them. And looking back at the work that those good people did back, 1975, the put down for their ideas like, let's have wind turbines, which we now recognize we need, were then poo-pooed. And Phil Asquith says in a clip, Google it afterwards, that was the put down was, that's in the realm of the brown bread and sandal brigade. and that's just the kind of thing. But
I'm sorry, I wasn't sure that was an answer to the question I asked.
No, I don't know why that is the case, but it is the case, and I don't think we need to worry too much about it.
No, I agree. When I was at college, I stood for election for the Green Party, and my hair was a lot shorter than it is now, and I was asked, why is it that all you long-haired hippies want whatever? And you know, we can be pigeonholed, and I've been pigeonholed as a left-wing extremist, but often the people doing the pigeonholing can be ridiculed too. I think in the end, what we need to do is just continue to point out that this doesn't settle disputes. You know, when I talked to one of Tony Blair's key advisors in Downing Street just days before the invasion of Iraq, I was lucky. I was married to somebody who worked in Downing Street, so I had a particular access. I asked him, you know, what's the real reason for Tony Blair going to war? And he said, because he thinks that there's a chance of remodeling the Middle East. There's a chance in a lifetime. And I said, and what gives him any sense that that's going to happen given the history? And I outlined all the historical conflict in the past and the way in which the British in particular had contributed to the problem, and how are we going to contribute to resolving this? And his response was, yes, it's a small chance, but it's still a chance. And it's like, ultimately, I think there is this idea that conflict gives us a final chance to resolve the conflict, and we need to just keep hammering away that this is a fantasy. It's a fantasy because in the end, if you hurt somebody, if you oppress them, if you win against them the battle, you'll still lose the war, because everyone loses the war in the end. And I think we just have to continue saying that, whether we get accused of being left-wing extremists or idealists or whatever other insult we get, because in the end, I think ultimately a lot of people out there agree with us.
Yeah. And you used the word insult and idealist in the same breath, and I used to think that when this was hurled towards me, oh, that's idealism. That used to hurt me, and because I know that's what it was meant to do, but I've stopped thinking that now.
What's wrong with being an idealist?
Exactly. Let's take these things as compliments.
Right. Okay, it's about time. We're bang on 2030, which is excellent. I must thank Mererid and thank Paul for a long session. We wondered whether it would be too long. Some of us wondered that more than others. But some of us, like me, don't have to be sitting on more meetings all during the day, because I don't work anymore. So thank you, both of you, for doing this in your spare time. Thank you for all the contributions, the questions. Thank you for coming, people who've come here tonight. And I do, if you're not members of MAW, have a look at the website. It's abolishwar.org.uk. I'm not going to try and type it in the chat because I'll look silly typing and looking at you at the same time. So, thank you very much. I will enjoy perhaps not a cake birthday celebration, maybe a more liquid birthday celebration for MAW's 20th birthday. And I wish you all a good rest of evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful.
Bye.
Yes.